Hello, listeners. Welcome back once again. Today, for our 70th episode, I'm joined by very special guest, Dominic Teich, fighter pilot, instructor, author, business owner, founder of the Single Seat Mindset. And it's hard to imagine a job that requires a greater combination of goal focus, resilience, decision-making ability, and a genuine love of what you do than being a fast-jet pilot. And the leadership and life lessons that can be learned from a uniquely challenging career path, an often high-stress working environment, and a job with a global reputation for excellence are varied and powerful. And Dominic will very kindly be sharing some of those lessons with us. We'll also be talking about his own journey from student to flight instructor, his less well-trod approach to fast-jet selection, and debunking some of the Top Gun myths along the way. So I hope you enjoy this one. If you want to find out more about the single seat mindset, then do be sure to listen all the way to the end to get the website details and more, or you can just check out the episode description. The links are in there. Also, don't forget to visit www.leadernotaboss.com for more about leading with integrity, how to join our community of new leaders, and more. This is Leading with Integrity Leadership Talk, the podcast for first-time managers who are working in tech-driven businesses and teams and who want to be more effective, people-first leaders. Each week, you will learn the crucial strategies, mindsets, and practical tips that successful modern leaders follow to be engaging, ethical, and authentic managers who get the best from their teams. And we'll achieve all of this via weekly conversations with leaders, with leadership experts, entrepreneurs, and business owners, people who have already walked this path and have some amazing insights to share, with an added sprinkling of occasional solo episodes and some group chats where we'll have multiple guests. My name is David Hatch, and I will be your host. And leadership has always been a passion for me. After a career spent in a series of small businesses during 15 years in the aerospace industry, 5 or 6 of those at the end of that career were in a space startup in the UK, so trying to launch satellites into orbit, very cool stuff. And through all of that experience, I learned that the secret to successful management is in the ability to apply great leadership. And in turn, the secret to great leadership, it's all about your integrity, putting people before profits.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Let me start by saying, Dominic, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. It's really great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be an interesting one. I'm just going to let you talk for a bit and tell listeners a bit about yourself, your background, what you get up to today, because I know that's quite a long list as well, and why you do what you do, really.
Nice. So I'm a fighter pilot. I'm an instructor pilot. So I teach people how to fly fighter jets, but then I own a couple of different businesses, and one of them that is really taken off for us is it's called Single Seat Mindset. Essentially, fighter pilots that have learned, and I think that's the big thing, is it's a learned behavior, is how to learn how to be a single seat fighter pilot and to teach people that. And so as of this year, as of this recording, we'll have 50 fighter pilot stories in print in the Single Seat Wisdom book series. So 3 books there, and it's been kind of growing. It started out as a hobby, and I quickly realized after the first book that it was probably the worst hobby that I had. So I decided to monetize it, and then we take all the funds from that business and we give it to a children's cancer nonprofit. So it kind of keeps our vision and our why, on the right path and not distracted by profit.
Yeah, and that's the way to go, isn't it? I mean, well, I think it is anyway. There's so many businesses out there where that profit motive it leads them down the wrong path, doesn't it? So yeah, really
Yeah, I think
applaud that.
you could end up taking jobs or doing things that maybe the bigger why it doesn't support that. Obviously, you need to have a job. You need to be able to make money and live. But yeah, it's sure helped. It sure helped us, keep our purpose clear as we move forward. So
Yeah, no, it's the way to be, I think. And so life as a fighter pilot, then what kind of stuff do you get to fly?
So I've been pretty lucky. I've flown a number of different civilian and military airplanes. The civilian ones were, I went to college to be a pilot, to learn how to be a pilot, and I thought I was going to be a commercial pilot. And then I was a civilian flight instructor for a number of years before I decided to join the military, which is not a very common path to get into the military because it's so expensive to go through the civilian flight training. So I think that, if I could, I don't know if I would go back and change it, but that was definitely something that set me back monetarily when I joined the military. Was I had a lot of school debt. But yeah, we fly. Right now, I'm flying the F-16. It's designed to be a single seat fighter jet. We do have 2-seat models that, I can sit in the back, or I can take a incentive flyer up in the back and fly around. They can get a little taste of what we do.
Oh, nice. My real question I'm getting to here is what is it actually like to be a fast jet pilot? Because obviously there's the whole Hollywood style, isn't there? And Tom Cruise has a lot to answer for in this, I think. It's just about the hangovers and the sunnies and breaking all the rules and all that sort of thing, or not. Tell us the truth.
I mean, I think there are some little aspects to that stuff that, I'm chuckling at because, we do. I have a pair of aviator sunglasses. It's not like everybody wears those. I definitely do not fly with a hangover or with any sort of alcohol in my system, just because it is, if you know how you feel when you're hungover, and if you were to get up in the morning and do go out for a sprint and just run really hard, it doesn't feel good. I would imagine probably the same type of feeling there. And then in regards to breaking the rules, I don't have enough brain bites to really do that. Just because there's already so many cool things we get to do in the airplane. And I just think that the tolerance for breaking the rules, especially nowadays, from the start of my career until now, they've just really started to crack down on that stuff. So it makes it even less appealing to try to think up something that I could do to break the rules, like come in really low and fast and smoke the control tower with a afterburner going in the airplane. The airplane is already so much fun to fly in the first place that I don't know if there's a whole lot of space for that.
Yeah, that's fair. And even if it was fun, it'd potentially be your last flight, so it'd have to really be worth it, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And it's funny you say that. Well, it's actually not really funny. There's in recent history, there were a couple of pilots that will go unnamed, and I'm not even going to say the airframe that they're in, but they did some stuff that they broke the rules, and they ended up damaging some aircraft and some stuff. And I think that was their last flight. I can't say for sure, but that's the kind of thing that can happen. And then even worse, you could end up hurting yourself or hurting somebody else, or it's a dangerous business. So I think it needs to be treated that way.
Absolutely. And an expensive business as well.
Yes.
Those aircraft aren't cheap, are they? And neither are the pilots, of course. Many years of training, as you've spoken about already. Can you tell us a bit more then about the process to becoming a fighter pilot? I mean, understanding that you didn't follow the traditional path, what does it normally look like?
As I see these, as I've written or helped these other fighter pilots write their stories, I'm beginning to realize that there isn't really a normal path to becoming a fighter pilot. There are some things that you can do. But what I've noticed is that many of the fighter pilots that I know that have written stories in the single seat wisdom books, that there's a lot of grit behind it because it's not an easy career field to get into in the first place. And if you're one to throw your hands up in the air and just say, it's not for me, I'm going to do something else. I think that literally the mindset is one of the most important things. Now, with that said, there are a couple of things that can really help you out. Obviously, staying away from drugs and not getting arrested and going to jail, and like having a clean record, and playing sports and academically succeeding as you're growing up. Those are all important things. And then to be a military officer, you have to have a 4-year degree. So whether you get that on your own like I did, or if you go through a college that has an ROTC program, I believe the UK has very similar programs as well. And then there's also the service academies. So there's the Air Force Academy, there's Merchant Marine Academy. There's all these different academies you can go through to get your degree. So that's your 4-year degree. And then after graduating, ROTC or a service academy, I think it's in their last year is when they kind of find out where they tracked, meaning what kind of job are they going to get in the military. In my case, I wasn't willing to do that because I had already paid for college. I was already a pilot, and I already had enough time and hours to go fly for an airline. So I didn't want to join the military only to be a finance officer. And it's not to bag on finance officers, but I want to fly airplanes. And I didn't want to be a navigator. I didn't want to do other things. I just wanted to fly. So I went through officer training school. And before you go through a big, long process. In my case, they lost my paperwork 3 times. So my whole process of interviewing and medically qualifying and doing all that stuff was about a 2-year process for me, just to get to the point where they're like, hey, you got selected to be a pilot. And then, oh, by the way, your class doesn't start until, later this year. So it was a big, long wait. During that time, I was flying civilian airplanes and making ends meet doing that. But yeah, it's a big old process. And then once you get to pilot training, there's going through boot camp, and then learning how to be an officer, and learning how the military works, and in processing to your base. It's all of the stuff that's not fun, but that there's a bigger why at the end. And that follows, there's a flight screening program to see if you're cut out to fly, and it's in a small airplane just to see if you're going to throw up and see if you have any flying aptitude. And then from there, the T6 is a Pilatus-made airplane. You'll go fly that. It's a fully aerobatic airplane with ejection seats. And then after that is where everybody kind of splits up. So it's a pretty long process to even get to that point. And then once you're in the T6 and you're learning how to fly that airplane, once you're done with that training is when they give you your track. So whether you go fighter track or the tanker airlift track or the helicopter track, there's different tracks that you can go.
Presumably the fighter pilot is the one that everyone wants to be. Is there much say you have in it at that stage of the process, or is it a question of aptitude?
Yeah, I think it's important to convey to the right people, what you want to do with your career. So in my case, I sat down with my flight commander at the time and I said, hey, conceptually, I've been working my whole life to be a fighter pilot. I want to do that. And, obviously flying upside down and pulling G's and wearing a mask and all this stuff that I haven't done. But I just want you to know that that's where I'm working towards. And then he worked with me during training to kind of pair me up with fighter pilots so I could start kind of learning. And then it was more of just hey, does this guy fit the mold type of thing before they tracked us. And I think the biggest thing that I learned through that whole process, that arduous process of being a pilot, is the we have so much instant gratification nowadays. And if you're not committed to a long-term goal and you're not willing to do that, a lot of the very simple things in life, they're not really lasting. They don't have a whole lot of, but if you spend many years getting to a place, there's a lot to be said about that. If you become a doctor or a lawyer, or even finishing your 4-year degree or graduating from high school, those are all big accomplishments that take some commitment. And I think that's what I learned the most, is just not giving up. And there's going to be roadblocks along the way. How
has all of that kind of helped you in other areas of your life? Which you started to answer that, but in what you've said there, it struck me there's a huge parallel there to being a business owner or trying to get into leadership and management. It's exactly that instant gratification thing. And so many people especially entrepreneurs when they start their first business. And then if
Yeah.
they don't make their millions, like by the end of the week, they give up and decide it's not for them. And you've got to play the long game, and that's exactly it. And that's such an important lesson, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, if you're one that's addicted to social media and you're trying to be an influencer and you're running down that track, that can be a really lonely track, especially if you are, if you haven't done something difficult in your life. And I find that a lot of the influencers online, you'll look at them, if you watch that kind of stuff, for a lot of people, I would imagine it probably is pretty depressing to watch that, because you're then envious about that person or whatever they're doing. And I think a lot of people miss the fact that to get to that level, there's an incredible amount of work that goes into it. So I think you see the surface level stuff. It's cool, I could make a lot of money, but you miss the bigger picture, which is, I'd be willing to bet that person probably doesn't watch a whole lot of social media themselves, and they're in the background and they're really hustling and working.
I hope so, because it'd be even more depressing if not, wouldn't it? I don't know. I mean, maybe like 1 or 2 out of a few million, they can just do it like that, and it's very easy for them. But for the average person, I mean, you got to play the probabilities, haven't you? You got to play that long game. You got to be willing to put in the grind and the graft and all those other G words.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit more then about the single seat mindset and what makes it particularly unique.
Yeah. So I don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if any of your guests know this, but I don't know of a single online source or any book or books that have collaborated with 50 fighter pilots in one place. So we have what I wanted to build was a company that is not beholden to stakeholders and profits. And I wanted to put together a community of fighter pilots that isn't just one voice, that is not just me. And so that's kind of what we've grown into. Is this year we'll publish our 50th fighter pilot story, and they're short, and they're short for a reason, because people are busy. And I find that a lot of the people that want to get going somewhere, they don't have time to sit down and read a big, lengthy book. So the knowledge that we provide, how you would use that if you were, reading it, is, you could flip it open and just be like, hey, I'm struggling with X, Y, or Z, and whether or not you want to be inspired to keep going. One of the chapters that I'm actually editing right now, that's going to be published in the next book, was just that. It was literally years of struggle, just like me. And so as I was reading the story, I just had to laugh, because this guy made it and he did the same thing. And I saw just the determination. And there's going to be those times where you're like, man, is this really for me? Should I be doing this? So I think that knowledge is either from, we've been lucky. We have guys that have written stories that are in their first fighter pilot assignment, so really young, all the way to retired Air Force generals that have flown multiple fighter jets, to one guy was a Top Gun instructor, no kidding, in the F-14 Tomcat, F-18, and then he flew Air Force F-16s, and he has 1,000 hours in all, over 1,000 hours in all 3 of those airplanes. We have an astronaut that's also a test pilot and a fighter pilot that wrote a story. So there's a lot of different perspectives across the whole spectrum of, hey, this is kind of what I went through. And then at the end of it, it just kind of sums it up. And then you can put that into action. Because I think a lot of times you'll read stuff and be like, oh, I'm inspired, but I don't know what to do with that. So ours is very practical life advice. And a lot of people would think, well, I don't want to be a pilot. Why would I listen to that? Well, a fighter pilot, and this is, I'm going to try to say this in the most humble way possible. They are the athletes essentially of the aviation world. It's a lot of work. It's very physically and also mentally demanding. So to be a fighter pilot, there's a couple of different aspects that go into that, and a lot of the same things that you see, major league ball players or athletes go through. Fighter pilots are going to go through a lot of the same stuff, but there's a lot of brainy mental stuff that goes on too, even though it may not seem that way.
And it's a hell of a lot more risky than the average athlete, I would say, as well.
Yeah.
But glad to hear that you're not too exclusive, and it's not just single seat pilots and Air Force types, and that you're a bit more inclusive. So that's nice to hear as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we want to, if somebody's down and out, whether or not you're an entrepreneur, business owner, you're a grad student, you're in high school, a lot of the stories, there will be something applicable to you. And I think that there's something to be learned from that, whether it's just as simple as saying, hey, your goal is a long-term goal and there's going to be roadblocks during this whole time. So, keep it on, as they say, and eventually you'll get there. You may get really derailed and really off your path at some point. You may find a different path, but you'll look back and if you kept at it, I think you'll really enjoy that fact later on in your life.
Yeah, or as we would say in this country, I guess it's keep calm and carry on, isn't it?
Yeah.
And make a tea. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think you've already answered the next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway in case you have another perspective to add. So this question is, why would someone use that fighter pilot knowledge to help them in other walks of life?
Yeah, I think it's just to sum it up, there's a lot of practical lessons that you can learn in the third dimension that we fly in every day that are applicable to the different walks in life, whether those are, doctors, lawyers, athletes, like I said, you're going to college, you're in high school, it doesn't matter. I think they're very applicable to the basics that you need to help yourself out every day.
Right, let's move on and talk a bit about leadership then. So I think you're going to have a particularly interesting perspective on this, given your career history. What is the biggest leadership lesson that you've taken from your career so far?
So, David, I think the biggest thing for me, it's probably going to be different for everybody. I think there's a lot of personality traits that you'll bring along with yourself, and having worked so diligently and for so many years to get into a single seat fighter jet, and then from there become an instructor pilot, and go through all those hoops. And then fast forward, I now have a beautiful wife and kids, and I'm starting my first business, and I've got all of my protective mechanisms that have helped me get to where I am. And the biggest leadership lesson that I learned particularly was just getting out of my own way. And I know that that's kind of maybe cliche. However, it really broke me when I bought our first. So I grew up kind of in real estate. My old man owned real estate. I started doing the same thing, but then it broke me when I bought our first 8-unit little mini apartment, and we were renovating it, and I'm a very hands-on, I'll do it myself kind of guy, and it broke me. And that was a big lesson learned for me, was I'm getting my own way. And I think the lesson that I learned was, as a leader, you need to know when to fire yourself. So I started firing myself from all of the things that I was doing that I know that I could hire somebody else to do. They would do it correctly. They would do it better than me. And that just took a lot of, I think there's maybe a little dose of humility that I needed. I needed a lot of humility, and I just needed to get out of my own way. So I think what I learned, to sum it up, was just, hey, as you're sitting back and you're struggling with your business or whatever you're doing in life, is ask yourself, what do I need to stop doing? Because a lot of things I need to be able to say yes, not to the good thing, not to the better thing, but I need to say yes to the best thing. And then as I do that, I need to go, well, who else can do this better than me? And that takes a little bit of time and kind of learning yourself. Yeah,
I really like that. And I think it's something that pretty much everyone can identify with, whether you're a business owner or not, just in your career. I think a lot of people, I know I've made that mistake like 3 or 4 different times.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you just feel, especially when you're running your own business, and you just feel like you have to do everything.
Yeah.
But actually, if you try and do everything, you're going to do a lot of things badly.
Yeah. No, granted, when you're starting out, that's part of the learning process.
True. Yeah.
And you do, as the business owner, you do need to know how all the little parts and pieces work. However, you don't need to do it yourself. In fact, I think the team aspect is something that you're hinting at, whether or not you hire employees, or if you contract things out, which is a very common thing to do nowadays. It's how I do things. I work under a contract basis, so I don't have to worry about all of the employee and personnel issues.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I guess that's the COVID years, isn't it? In a lot of
Yep.
respects, has made that more
Yep.
widespread. Yeah, you're right. I guess when you're first starting out, it's going through that short-term pain, isn't it, to figure out what you're not good at and what you do
Yep.
need to offload to whoever it ends up being. But
Yeah. And I think there's you're kind of if I was to say what is like my biggest mistake, it's kind of hinting at what we just talked about, right? It's trying to do everything myself as a leader and figuring out how to communicate that to other people, hiring other people that can actually do it faster. And maybe in the very short term, I don't make as much money, but months down the road, you're not only recapturing those funds, but you're making a lot more, right? So it gives you that accelerated acceleration with your business. It's just part of the learning process. So I think that's a big mistake, especially as a business owner, is I'll do it all myself. However, there is some value in kind of figuring out what you want to do. And for me, I like the startup phase. I have a lot of energy when something's starting, but then as the machine gets going, I kind of get bored. So I think I'm better as a founder, but less good as a CEO and somebody that runs the business. I can do it, but it's not really one of my working like genius things. It's just I get bored. So then I'm off to the next thing. And so sometimes I have to kind of rein myself back in and be like, no, just be happy with where you are right now. Stop looking to the future all the time.
all of this wraps up nicely into that whole concept of self-awareness, really, isn't it? And you mentioned humility earlier. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, aren't they? It's being able to reflect on what you personally are good or bad at and then use that to drive your decisions. And I think that is such an important leadership skill in any context, really.
Yeah.
So we've talked a bit about the mistakes already, but if you had to pick the biggest mistake that you think most leaders make, what would it be?
In the military, in my civilian, in the civilian world, when I was working as an employee for a flight school, and then in the military, and then in the business world, I think the biggest mistake, and this is again very, very subjective. I think a lot of business owners, because they try to do everything, they are micromanagers. And when you micromanage people, I've seen it happen so many times. You typically create this divide, and it's either you're creating a yes man, somebody that is just going to listen to you and do exactly what you say. And so if your plan involves running off of a cliff and just destroying your business, you're going to have a lot of people just right behind you running off that cliff. And then it creates the other side of the spectrum, which is really where I fall into when somebody's trying to micromanage something that I'm working on, especially if they've given that project to me. You develop a very passive aggressive employee that doesn't want to do anything with you. So there's this huge divide that happens. And I wasn't very graceful at communicating that because I didn't know what was going on with a lot of the leaders that I worked with. Or you could say people in leadership positions, because many of them aren't good leaders. So I think that's maybe something important that I learned in the military. Then when I started my other businesses, I realized that. So anytime I'm talking to, in my case, a contractor, somebody that's doing stuff, up front, I say, hey, I like to learn and I want to know what's going on. Don't confuse that with micromanaging. So for the first couple of months, I'll just be asking a ton of questions because that's how I learn. And I'm not, and I will challenge you, but don't take offense to that. I just want you to back up your argument. And then when I do ask you a question, I legitimately want to know where you want to go with it. And then the next piece that is so important to that is sometimes, even if it's not the best decision, if you're trying to enable somebody to grow and make their own decisions, you have to let them make the decision, even if you know it's maybe not the best one. And that one's always difficult for me to do, but there's a lot of power in that as a leader to kind of give that rope, and then you can kind of surprise yourself sometimes. I think as a business owner, and go, oh, that actually was a really good or a really good way to do that, and I would have actually dorked it up, and they did a lot better job at it.
Oh yeah, there's so much to be said, I think, for giving people the freedom to fail. In business, anyway. Maybe not as a flight instructor. That might be a different kettle of fish.
No, it's the same. It's the same thing, David. If you're
Okay.
always jumping in the way and correcting the student, they won't learn.
Right.
And then, so in the back seat of an F-16, the students only get a couple, 3-4 flights maybe with a guy in the back seat, and then they solo the airplane. And then most of the program, other than a couple of rides, a few rides through the program, they're flying solo. And there's other fighter jets in the U.S. inventory as well that they're single seat jets. They don't have two seaters. So your first flight is solo. And if you're constantly, if I'm in the back seat, or if I'm in the other jet and I'm talking on the radio and I'm constantly fixing what the student is messing up, I'm not giving them the chance to fix it themselves, because I'm going to see it way sooner than them, because I've been doing it a long time. So there's that healthy balance of, one of the guys that wrote a chapter in Single Seat Wisdom, I think it was volume 1, he called it comfort containers. And it was literally, as you become a better instructor pilot, you can let a student go a little bit further because you can kind of see where it's going and be able to correct them back. As a young guy, you're more apt to just, like kind of a platitude, but take the reins and fix it before it gets too bad and you can't, it spirals out of control. So I think there's a healthy balance there. And it's like you've said just previously, like knowing yourself. How far can you let this go to where are we actually learning something here? Or is the student digging himself a hole, or is my employee digging themselves a hole that they won't be able to climb out of? It's very applicable, both business and in the aviation world. Letting people make mistakes, learning from that, letting them catch that. It's super important.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I would have expected it to be slightly different than that, but thank you. What achievement then in your whole career history so far are you most proud of?
Getting selected to be a fighter pilot.
That was
that
easy,
simple.
wasn't it?
Yeah, that was an easy one for me. I love lighting myself on fire and just doing something that many people will never ever get to experience.
That's kind of what I thought you would say, to be honest, but I had to ask. Okay, and so if you could start your career over again, if you could go back in time, would you do anything differently?
That's a really good question. I think it's challenging me to, as I think about that, I think there are some junctures as I was growing up and going through college and doing things that I would have done differently. I don't know if I would have taken a different path, if that's the main question. But there are things that I did that I'm not proud of. There's, the personality that was behind my why was, I was a pretty spicy young guy. I was very driven and pretty brash. And I was a very, very, very hard worker. And that's because that's what I learned you needed to do in order to be part of that community and to survive and then thrive from that. So I think I learned all those lessons. But then as I started kind of coming up in the ranks, it was less about my practical knowledge on how to fly an airplane. And it was a lot more about, I'm working with people. The team is important. Obviously speaking up when things aren't right is important as well. However, you see this a lot in, and I'm trying to remember the friend that I just talked to, but he said, as a young salesman, you get this guy that is just great at sales. And he's like the salesman of the year, 3, 4, 5 years in a row. And then you go, well, this guy's going to be a great leader. So then you put him in charge of a leader in a leadership position in a team, and he's terrible because he knew all of the very practical nuts and bolts about sales, but he knew nothing about working with a team and working with people. So I think that's kind of the jump that I had to make. And really, I had to fire myself from trying to do everything. I remember leading we took a bunch of aircraft on a trip into southern Japan. And, I was working with the Japanese government and I was learning a lot of stuff, but that trip broke me because I realized there's no way that I'm going to be able to do everything myself. And I just need to ask for help. I wasn't like delegating in a bad way, but I was just like, hey, you know what? I'm stretched too thin. I can't be in 6 to 9 different places at once. I need some help. And that's kind of where I started to learn that part, of myself, really.
It's particularly interesting, the story about the salesman, because it's a phenomenon that comes up so many times, and it's become one of my pet hates, actually. This whole accidental manager problem where you're promoted for being good at your last job and not taught how to do your next job. And one thing I've found particularly interesting, talking to a couple of guys in the UK who used to serve in the Air Force here and one from the Army, the way, I don't know if it's the same in the US, the way the military does it there, but the leadership training aspect, you're trained for the job before you're given the job.
Yeah.
Whereas in the commercial world, it's quite often the other way around, if at all. And I just find that a really interesting dynamic, and I'd love to know why more companies don't do it the same way as the military does.
Yeah, I mean, they've just been doing it. So there's some big pitfalls, and I think the UK, the physical size of the UK being smaller than the US, you probably have, I'm just guessing, you probably have military officers, military personnel in one place a little bit longer than we do. But we move around quite a bit in the US military. So the downside to that is that I think in that first year, you're just, so if you're trying to turn an organization around as a leader and you're trying to do it in a year, I don't know if that's really going to happen, especially if it's a big organization. Now, granted, if it's your company and you're a startup, completely different thing. But from a bureaucratic big organization standpoint, a lot of these squadron commanders and wing commanders, that kind of stuff, they're in the position 1 to 2 years. And, even if you look at, the U.S. president, it's a 4-year term. Granted, they can get reelected for 4 years, but in 4 years, you can do some stuff, but it's just, in those first 1 to 2 years, you're just fighting the beast and trying to move this huge ship. It's on this vector. And so by year 3, you might be getting some headway. And so typically at year 3 in the active duty military, you're moving. So it's very difficult, I think, from a big standpoint to really steer or move something in a direction if you're there for a short period of time, a short period of time being less than 3 years. However, there are good aspects to that, right? The good aspects is that we get to see a lot of different jobs. Typically, as a young officer, you're kind of learning different jobs every year. So you'll be the chief of scheduling. You will be the flight commander. You'll be the, what have you. You'll jump around. You'll be the deployment officer. You've got these different jobs. So you kind of learn all the different jobs. I don't remember. There's a rental car company here in the US that does that. They do. You have to go through essentially every different office. You have to work in every office if you're on that leadership track, just so that you know what everybody does. So I think that is something that is very important for everybody to do, is not just pigeonhole yourself into one thing. And then you're just like, well, why isn't it working? And it's like, well, you don't know how the bigger machine works. But again, moving around too much generates some inconsistencies, within an organization as well. So that's that's a little bit of a balancing act.
Presumably then that's why there is standardized leadership training, so that every time you get a new leader or you go to a new organization, it's the same approach. I don't know. I mean, I kind of think the moving around thing on balance is probably more of a positive than a negative, just because it's going to prevent or reduce that sort of bureaucratic mindset, isn't it, where you just get stuck in your ways and you don't change and you get in a rut and all that sort of thing, which you see in quite a lot of other parts of government, shall we say.
Yeah. And then, it kind of depends on the person too, David, and you've probably seen this, but like if you go through leadership training, you could erroneously think that leadership training that you received, well, it's now rote memory. So if you're not a gifted leader, which many are not, it's kind of a learned behavior. You have to learn how to do that. But you can start, and I've seen this, and it's really clunky and it's not genuine. You start to very artificially and robotically apply those lessons, but it's the wrong situation and it doesn't match. So I think there's a little bit of knowing yourself, because you as the leader in that situation with those people on that specific day, it requires something unique. And that's, I think, really what makes a good leader. And then knowing that most of the time you're going to mess it up, just go back and tell people that you messed it up. And that's something that I learned too, was just going, hey, I'm totally jacked that up. And this is what we can do next time. This is our lesson learned. And then you get back on your feet and you try to put your pride away and eat some humble pie and move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a lesson that I wish more politicians would take to heart, I must say, particularly in recent years.
Yeah.
Okay. So one question that I've completely forgotten to ask, and I won't forgive myself if I don't ask, is there a story behind the nickname Slice? And if so, can you tell us?
Yep. So the 30-second version is that I was, because many people have seen Top Gun or at least know what dogfighting is in fighter aircraft. So I was dogfighting. We were doing high aspect training. So it's where you pass very close with another aircraft, just outside of 500 feet. And as you pass, off your shoulders, once the aircraft passes, it's fights on. So we were doing that type of fighting that day. And we did a bunch of sets. We landed with the jets on. We got gas. We took off again. So we had a lot of training that was happening that day. And it was on the last set. I got a little bit too greedy and I pointed at the other aircraft, which he was my instructor pilot at the time. And I broke a training rule. So I pointed at him for too long while I was taking simulated missile shots, and we had a very close pass. And in the fighter pilot world, we have a naming ceremony, essentially, which is really more of a way to kind of beat people down. And it's it's one of those things. And so they said I tried to slice my instructor pilot in half with my jet, and it kind of fit too because I was in a squadron. The samurai was our mascot. So I've been called a lot worse. I'm very grateful to have the call sign Slice because the ones that preceded that, I'm not super proud of.
Fair enough. Well, thanks for sharing the story.
Yeah.
And I quite like the way that can help with maintaining the humility because, I mean, fighter pilots and pilots generally aren't known for their small egos, if I'm honest. But maybe that's unfair generalization. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Leadership Heroes.
Well, I only have one question left now. This is my favourite question. It is intentionally difficult. So we'll see what you come out with. It's called Leadership Heroes. And so the question is, if you had to pick one person, and they can be alive or dead, past, present, real, fictitious, if you really like, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
So you've probably heard it before. Dead, Jesus. I mean, that dude did some crazy stuff. I mean, just what he went through and how he was betrayed and how how that whole story shook out. You've probably heard that before. So I would say somebody that's alive, modern day, that embodies that is a guy named Tim Ballard, and his story came out in a movie called The Sound of Freedom. And it just came out on the 4th of July in 2023. And he essentially was a Homeland Security agent. He's going after pedophiles and these big groups of people that are in the human trafficking world. And he starts rescuing children in large groups. So the story is... it's incredibly it's a very emotional story because this is a real story. It's real life. It's happening right now today. But this dude, Tim Ballard, is going in and he's rescuing children that are caught up in the sex trade and caught up in the human trafficking rings, which is one of the, I didn't know this before watching the movie, but it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, it's I think he said $150 billion a year industry or something like that, where they're basically selling humans. And the thing that I didn't really think of before is that he said you can sell a bag of cocaine one time. You can sell a human 5 times a day. So it's a pretty dark, it's not a happy, feel-good movie, but it is a real story. And what Tim Ballard did and what he's doing is it's freaking incredible how he's saving these little kids, and and just really the message, I think, behind the movie The Sound of Freedom is pretty inspiring. That dude's my hero.
Hard to think of a tougher leadership challenge than that kind of environment, that kind of context, and what he must have to deal with day in, day out.
I think that if I was to give one lesson from it in his shoes, is as the leader, as the business owner, as the entrepreneur, you are going to have to make very difficult decisions. You can ask other people for their opinions, but at some point you have to make the decision. And it's very lonely. If you're the president, I would imagine it's pretty lonely making those decisions, because you're the last person that has to go, we're going to do this. And it's not always very popular. And in Tim Ballard's case, what he did was, oh man, I would hope that I had the courage to do that. But if you watch the movie The Sound of Freedom, I don't know. That would have been a big inflection point in my life for sure. But just making those decisions, it has to be you if you're the person in that position.
Indeed. Yes, absolutely. Well, I hadn't heard of the film, so I'll add it to my watch list now. Thanks for the recommendation.
You bet. I think it's still in theaters, so I don't know.
Okay.
But my wife recently told me that it's going worldwide. It's going into theaters all around the world, which they didn't think that was going to be able to happen. Wow. But it's awesome. It's a movie that it's worth your time.
Okay, great. So last thing really is, if the listeners would like to learn a bit more about you, what you do, perhaps get a copy of one or two of your books that you worked on, would you like to point them towards a website or similar?
Yeah, so you can find kind of our launch pad or our runway, for lack of a better term, is singleseatmindset.com. We're single seat fighter pilots. So singleseatmindset.com is where it started, and that's where you'll get all the single seat series books. And that's where you can find us. There's also ways to contact me on there as well if you're looking for something else, or if I just had a lady reach out to me the other day. She wanted to buy a bulk order of books, and so we can make that happen there. But yeah, singleseatmindset.com.
Awesome. And I'll put the link to that in the episode description as well, so everyone can find it easily. Well, that's all from me. Thank you again so much for taking the time out of your morning to talk to us today. It's been really interesting and enlightening. Much appreciated.
Thank you, David.
Thank you again so much to Slice for his time today. Great conversation. Obviously a subject that I'm personally very interested in as well, in case you couldn't tell. But I hope, listeners, that you all found that useful and interesting. As I said earlier, if you would like to learn more about Dominic and what he gets up to, the links are in the episode description, so you can click on those and find out more. And if you are a new manager, a first-time leader, and you're struggling to be heard, to find your leadership voice, then Leading with Integrity is here to help. If the podcast itself isn't enough, please do visit www.leadernotaboss.com. There you will find a host of resources that can take you that next step further, including our Find Your Biggest Leadership Challenge quiz. So that's quite new. Hope you find that useful. You can find links there as well to other episodes of the podcast, to join our Integrity Leaders community of new managers. And there is also a link on that page where you can book some time with me directly in my calendar to have a chat about leadership, which, as you may have noticed by now, I can go on for hours about. So I hope to hear from you soon. That's all we've got time for this week. And I hope you'll join us again next week. And we have another veteran joining us, this time the retired spy, JJ Broom. So that's going to be an equally interesting conversation, I feel, but I'm biased, obviously, but it's coming from a very different angle on leadership and military service. So plenty more lessons to be learned. Hope you'll join us then. I'll see you then. I won't see you, but you might see me and you'll definitely hear me. And in the meantime, remember, stay safe and be a leader, not a boss.